Today's lesson is Shrinking Ice, Swelling Seas. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're talking about ice, basically, in the world and what it has to do with global warming. And is there a relationship between melting ice and swelling seas? Does the level of the oceans go up because the polar ice caps are melting? It's a good question.
Absolutely. And of course, with the global temperatures rising all over the place, and especially in the north, the polar ice caps, that's the ice that makes up both the North Pole and the South Pole down in Antarctica, as well as all the glaciers and icebergs that sort of have water trapped inside them, of course, in the form of ice. A lot of these are melting. And, it kind of seems logical as the ice turns into water and that water flows into the ocean. Well, the oceans will get bigger, as if you're putting more water into a bathtub. And the problem with that is that for people who live near the ocean, they could suddenly find themselves living in the ocean. And this could be a serious problem for many cities around the world.
Yeah, if you're from Denver, Colorado, you're probably
okay.
You're okay because you're a mile high there. But, if you live here in good old Taipei or in Kaohsiung or wherever, this is a concern. Are our homes going to be flooded permanently because of global warming? But, the question is, what does that have to do with ice and the ice melting in the world? There are different ways in which this ice melts, and it comes from different places, which we'll talk about as our lesson continues. So let's talk about this shrinking ice, swelling seas. Let's read the first part.
Shrinking ice, swelling seas. It's no myth that the Earth is getting warmer. Since the 1800s, humans have been burning fossil fuels at an alarming rate. As a result, the global average surface temperature is 2 degrees Celsius higher than it was in the pre-industrial era. One of the most extreme possible outcomes of this global temperature rise is the melting of the world's ice, the effects of which could change the surface of our planet forever.
大家好，第一部分我们看到单字 era， 也可以念成 era。这个字是名词，指时代、年代或是时期。例如 ，The 19th century was an era of technological development in Europe。19世纪在欧洲是个科技发展的时代。或是 The president promises to bring about a new era of peace。总统承诺要创造一个新的和平时代。
Okay, so of course in the title we've got shrinking. To shrink just means to get smaller. If you throw your wool sweater in the dryer, of course it's going to shrink. It's going to get smaller. You don't want to do that. So yes, shrinking means to get small. And swelling here means to get large, like if you get injured or something. If you sprain your ankle, for example, then a bunch of fluid will gather around your ankle. It will get bigger. We say that your skin is swelling there.
Right, so as the ice gets smaller, the seas get bigger, basically. It's no myth, the article begins, it's no myth that the Earth is getting warmer. Yes, this is not a myth, this is not a fairy tale, it's not a rumor, it's not a bit of gossip, it's a fact. So basically we're saying it's not a story, it's not a belief, it's not an idea from someone's imagination that the Earth is getting warmer. It is. It's a fact that the Earth is getting warmer. Since the 1800s, humans have been burning fossil fuels at an alarming rate. This is what most scientists credit with the rising world temperatures on the Earth. Humans have been burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, things made from oil or coal, basically, is what we're talking here. Pollution, CO2, global warming, the greenhouse effect, that type of thing. So burning fossil fuels creates chemicals in the atmosphere, and that raises the temperature of the Earth. And so what happens then?
Well, as a result of that, as as a result of burning fossil fuels, the global average surface temperature is 2 degrees Celsius higher than it was in the pre-industrial era. So, of course, we're talking about the industrial era, which is when factories started to produce things and we started to get people working in factories and going to schools and stuff like that. It began in the 1800s or so. But in the time before that, when people were still basically farmers and there weren't that many factories around, we refer to that period of time as the pre-industrial era, the period of time before the industrial era began. So era just refers to a period of history. And so, yes, we're talking about the industrial era, which I believe we're still part of, and then the pre-industrial era before that.
Absolutely, yes. So it's a problem that we're dealing with today. It's sort of been growing over the last several hundred years, but it is becoming a very serious problem. And it says one of the most extreme possible outcomes of this global temperature rise is the melting of the world's ice, the effects of which could change the surface of our planet forever. So this isn't just a case of like, oh, it's a little bit hotter now than it was when I was young. This is about changing the surface of the planet forever. This is one of the possible outcomes of this global temperature rise. We're dealing with global warming and its effects now. We can make some good guesses on what will happen or how it will change things in the future, but we don't exactly know. But the possible outcomes, many of the possible outcomes, are not very good. What is an outcome? It's basically a result. What comes out of a process, what you end up with at the end of some type of process, okay? So we could actually say one of the most extreme possible results of global warming is the melting of the world's ice. This is an outcome, a result, what will happen because of a process. And if this does happen, if we do lose the polar ice caps and the world's ice does melt, the effects of this, or the effects of which, what we just talked about, the rise of the global temperatures, the melting of the ice, the effects of this, or the effects of which could change the surface of our planet forever. Absolutely, as Roger mentioned, Taipei. You can think of any big city near the coast. Tokyo, London, New York, Los Angeles, Sydney, Australia. Any place like that could suddenly find itself underwater.
Indeed, that is a possibility. It's a possible outcome. It's a possible consequence of this global temperature rising. Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part of our explanation for today. Let's go on and talk about the second part.
Most of our planet's ice is concentrated at the poles. The packed sea ice that forms the vast North Polar ice cap, which covers between 9 and 12 million square kilometers of ocean, is shrinking by more than 10% each decade. This disappearance of Arctic ice has a significant effect on weather systems, resulting in harsher winters, more frequent droughts, and violent storms.
第二部分我们看到形容词 polar 指两极的或是南北极的，例如People living in polar regions must be able to cope with freezing temperatures. 生存在北极的人必须能抵抗严寒气温。另外，除了上面的意思，这个字还可以指截然相反的，像是 The two brothers' personalities are at the polar ends of left and right, so they rarely agree on anything. 这两兄弟的个性截然相反，所以他们很少取得共识。接着我们看到单字 disappearance。这个字是名词，指消失或是失踪。举例来说 The police are looking into the disappearance of the child. 警方正在调查这起儿童失踪的案件。或是 The man's disappearance was never explained by the police. 警方不曾解释那名男子失踪的原因。另外，这个字去掉字尾 ance 就成了动词 disappear， 指消失不见。我们可以说The black mark on the shirt disappeared after Julie washed it. 衬衫上的黑色污点在 Julie 洗过后不见了。再来，我们看到形容词 Arctic， 指北极的或是北极地区的。例如 A cold Arctic weather system brought snow over the weekend. 寒冷的北极气候系统在周末带来了雪。另外补充一个相关形容词 Antarctic， Antarctic， Antarctic。指南极的或是南极地区的，像是 Scientists worry about the melting Antarctic ice. 科学家们担心南极地区融化的冰层。
Okay, most of our planet's ice is concentrated at the poles. Okay, so now we're focusing on ice in the world. And as you know, there is a lot of ice in the world, not just in your freezer. Okay, there's a lot of ice frozen at the poles or concentrated at the poles. We've got the North Pole and the South Pole. And indeed, most of our planet's ice is in those areas. They are concentrated there. Concentrated means they are focused in that area. Most of them are right there.
That's exactly right. And when we talk about at the poles, we mean the North and the South Pole, the northernmost area and the southernmost area of the world, the Arctic in the north and the Antarctic in the south. So that's where, since the temperatures are lower, most of the planet's ice is concentrated. That's where you find most of the ice. The packed sea ice that forms the vast North Polar ice cap, which covers between 9 and 12 million square kilometers of ocean, is shrinking by more than 10% each decade. So every 10 years, each decade, we lose 10% of the North Pole and specifically the ice cap, that sort of huge area of ice that floats on the Arctic Ocean up there in the North Pole. Because most people, I'm sure, know that the North Pole doesn't actually have any land underneath it like Antarctica. It's just floating ice. But there's a lot of ice there, but there's less and less every year, and 10% is lost every decade. So basically, if it goes at that rate in 100 years, you lose almost all of it. That would be absolutely terrible. And it says this disappearance, even losing smaller amounts of it, as we've been doing over the last few decades, this disappearance of Arctic ice has a significant effect on weather systems, resulting in harsher winters, more frequent droughts, and violent storms, all evidence of which we've seen around the world. And a lot of this is tied to the disappearance of Arctic ice. If something is there, you can see it, and then suddenly it's not there, it disappears. And that event, that happening, that circumstance is a disappearance. So we're using the verb to disappear, to suddenly not be there or not be visible, as a noun. So the disappearance of many species of animal is also a problem of the modern world that we live in. The disappearance of many ancient cultures has been a problem over centuries as well. So when things disappear, we talk about their disappearance.
Unfortunately, sometimes, especially in the United States, you hear about the disappearance of children. They get kidnapped and then they disappear and they're never heard from again. But in this particular case, we're talking about the disappearance of Arctic ice. It's just going away, or at least it's still there, but it's no longer ice. It's becoming water, of course. And that, of course, has a significant effect on weather systems, and that effect involves harsher winters. It gets really, really cold, and then you get more droughts when it doesn't rain so much. And, of course, Taiwan felt the effect of that nasty drought last year. And, of course, you get violent storms as well. Just a couple of months ago, of course, there were torrential rains all over the world, especially in Europe there. So, yeah, weather systems are changing as a result of that disappearance of Arctic ice. Arctic, of course, does refer to ice in the north part of the world. Antarctic ice would be down in Antarctica at the bottom of the earth. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson for today. It's time now to move on to the third part. Let's listen first.
But melting sea ice does not affect sea levels. Sea ice can be compared to ice cubes in a glass of water. When ice in a glass of water melts, it doesn't alter the level of water in the glass. Sea ice, however, is not the only type of ice at the poles.
第三部分我们看到片语 compare somebody or something to somebody or something， 表示将点点点比作点点点，或是认为点点点和点点点相似。我们可以说 Some people compare this writer to Jane Austen, but I don't think he is nearly as good. 有人将这位作家跟珍·奥斯汀相提并论，但我不觉得他有那么好。或是 The new building will be much nicer compared to the one that they are tearing down. 新大楼会比正在拆的那栋漂亮许多。最后我们看到动词 melt， 像是冰的融化和金属的融化。例如 The ice cream melted in the bowl before Doug could eat it. 在 Doug 来得及吃之前，冰淇淋就在碗里融化了。或是 The fire was so hot that it melted the metal of the car. 火是如此的烫，以至于把车子的钣金融化了。
Okay, so again, we're talking about melting sea ice, and that does sound bad. It does sound terrible, but it does not affect sea levels. That's interesting. I thought if all that ice melted, then the sea levels would rise, and then the water would go up to the waist of the Statue of Liberty, okay? And then she'd almost be totally underwater. But that's not the case. That does not happen as a result of sea ice melting.
Well, that's good, because even if the Statue of Liberty's shoes got wet, we would all be in deep trouble. So we definitely don't want it going up to her waist. But yes, as you say, sea ice melting does not affect sea levels. And actually, there's a good example here when you think about it. Sea ice can be compared to ice cubes in a glass of water. That's a good point. As the ice in your drink melts, it doesn't actually rise. It just turns from ice into water, and the volume inside the glass doesn't change that much. So we can actually compare sea ice to ice cubes in a glass of water. So it won't actually raise the volume or raise the level of the water, because the volume of the ice has always been part of the water since it's been there. It says when ice in a glass of water melts, it doesn't alter the level of water in the glass. So yeah, you can compare it to ice cubes, bin kwai, small pieces of ice that we use to cool down our drinks. If you compare sea ice to ice cubes, you'll kind of understand how this works. When you compare two things, basically you put them side by side and you kind of think of them on an equal level in some kind of not quite competition, but certainly looking at how they're similar, how they're different, and, making some kind of judgment or analysis based on that. If you're thinking of buying two cars, you might compare them. What do I get with this car for the price? What do I get with that one? How are they different? How are they the same? Which one's better? Which one's worse? You're comparing them. You're making a judgment by looking at them side by side. And when water melts, well, actually, we should say when ice melts, because water doesn't melt, ice does. When something melts, it goes from a solid into a liquid. So think of ice turning into water in a hot drink or in a warm glass of water. Think of butter turning into oil when you put it in the pan to fry something. It was hard piece of butter. Now it's liquid oil or liquid butter in the pan. It's gone from solid to liquid. It has melted.
Indeed, that's the process, the chemical process in which a solid turns into a liquid. It melts, okay? So that does not only refer to water, but it can refer to other things as well. And again, we're talking about this comparison here. If you got ice cubes in your glass of water, and if you sit there and you stare at it long enough, if you've got that kind of time, you will notice that the level of water in the glass will not change when the ice melts. So I guess we don't have to worry too much about the North Pole, or at least the polar ice cap over the top of the world melting. We don't have to worry about that too much, at least in terms of rising water levels. But hey, I think we're going to have to worry about the ice melting over Antarctica, because that is ice over land. That is something different, which we'll talk about, of course, in our next program. But again, when ice in a glass of water melts, it doesn't alter the level of water in the glass. Now, sea ice, however, is not the only type of ice at the poles. Yes, sea ice, ice in the ocean, ice in the sea.
So I guess what we mean here is that if the sea ice has already been part of the ocean level, right, just as the ice cube floating in your glass is shows the level of your glass and doesn't change as the ice melts, we haven't considered all of that glacier ice, all the ice that's frozen up in mountains and those frozen rivers, which is basically what a glacier is. And of course, not only do we have a lot of sea ice, the icebergs and the polar ice caps, but you think of like a place like Greenland, that massive island is basically a lot of glaciers, and Iceland as well, and Alaska. They have all these glaciers. Now, if that water melts, that's land ice, and that's going to go into the seas, and that, I imagine, would raise the level of the world's oceans. That's the type of ice that if we do allow it to melt and to run off into the oceans, we could see the higher levels of ocean water and higher tides and, flooding in more and more areas. And as we mentioned, this could be a serious problem. And I remember seeing sort of guesses in scientific articles saying, we could have 50, 80, 100, 500 million people having to move their homes as places in, cities like New York, New Orleans, these sort of coastal cities maybe don't become entirely flooded, but certainly lose huge areas, and the cost and expense of all these people having to move as they get away from the rising sea levels, not caused by the melting sea ice, but caused by melting glaciers.
Indeed, and of course, if those people have to move, people further inland are not exactly going to welcome them. I can't imagine people, say, in Kansas or Nebraska or Saskatchewan or wherever, welcoming all those people from the coast. They'll probably be thinking, hey, that's your problem. You deal with it. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation for today. It's time now to listen to our Chinese teacher, Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第一部分提到说，从1800年代以来，人类以惊人的速度燃烧化石燃料，结果全球平均地表温度比在工业时代前还高出摄氏2度。那文中用到 as a result， 它是副词片语，用来表达因此结果怎么样，那它就是用来带出表示结果的子句。当 as a result 摆在句首的时候，我们就会用逗号跟后面的子句隔开哦。好，那现在如果在 as a result 后面加上 of， 就会变成片语介系词。as a result of 表示因为由于，那是用来带出原因，后面是要接名词或动名词。例如 The workshop has been postponed as a result of the typhoon， 因为台风的关系，研讨会延期了。接着读到课文第二部分的第一句，他说地球大部分的冰都集中在南北极。好，北极叫做 the North Pole， 南极叫做 the South Pole。 那么句子里面这个 the poles 就是指北极和南极哦。另外文中它用到单字 concentrated 来形容集中的，那它是来自动词 concentrate。 好，看到 center 这个字根就表示 center 中心，那么之后通常会接母音，如果是接子音，那这个字根可能会拼作 centri 或者是 centro。 好，那么在 concentrate 这个字当中，它的字首 con 表示一起，字根 center 表示中心，再来 ate 是动词字尾，一起聚集在中心，这样应该很容易联想到 concentrate 它有集中聚集的意思。那我们顺便补充几个相同字根的单字。第一个是 centralize， 好，它的字根 center 表示中心，那么后面接 al 是形容词字尾，再来接 ize 则是动词字尾，用来表达使成为使变成。好，把它合在一起， centralize 的意思就是使什么集中，作为什么的中心。好，第二个补充的是 eccentric， 它是拼作 eccentric， 那么它的字首 ec 表示离开，字根 center 是中心，那么 ic 是形容词字尾。eccentric 这个字呢，本来是用在天文学里面表达轨道偏离中心的，那么后来才用来形容怪异的行径，带有这种行为不符合中心规范的那一种语义，所以 eccentric 可以用来描述它是古怪的，行径怪异的。好，那么第三个是 egocentric， egocentric，这个字当中的 ego 就表示自己的。好，那么 center 是指中心， ic 是形容词字尾，把它合在一起， egocentric 就是用来形容以自我为中心的，那就跟 self-centered 意思差不多。再来第四个补充的字是拼作 centripetal， centripetal 好，那它的字根 centri 表示中心，那么后面我们碰到子音了，所以我们看到这个字根它是拼作 centri 嘛，然后再来看到 pet 是寻找，而 al 是形容词字尾，那我们可以用寻找中心，一直要找到中心，朝向中心来联想说 centripetal 它是表达向心的，那么 centripetal force 就是用来表达向心力。好，那么以上是今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Era. Literature from that era features themes of scientific progress. Outcome. Jennifer's family waited for the doctor to announce the outcome of the surgery. Concentrated. Most economic activity is concentrated in major cities around the world. Drought. Australia has experienced several severe droughts in recent history. Melt. The snowman that the children had built began to melt. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.